Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, having your entire life violently dismantled. Like, your home has literally been burned to the ground.
Oh, man.
Yeah, the city you grew up in has been completely leveled. You and your family have been dragged as prisoners of war across this brutally hot, unforgiving desert to some massive foreign empire.
Right, just completely uprooted.
Exactly. And you're sitting there destitute, you're mourning people you've lost, and you're completely stripped of your identity. And then, get this, the very people who destroyed your life walk up to you, they mock you, and they demand that you entertain them.
Which is just so twisted.
It's horrific. They ask you to sing a happy, nostalgic song about the home they literally just burned down. So the question is, how do you process that level of dark, violent rage? Like, how do you survive that kind of profound trauma without letting the bitterness just literally eat you alive from the inside out?
Well, the crazy thing is, that is not a hypothetical scenario. I mean, that is the exact historically documented reality behind some of the texts we're exploring in this deep dive. And, it fundamentally changes how we have to approach this material.
It really does, because today we're looking into the final book of the Psalms, specifically chapters 107 through 150. And the reason I wanted to start with that specific image of utter devastation is because we really have to strip away the cultural baggage that surrounds these texts.
Yeah, we have to get rid of that immediately.
Right, because if you hear the word Psalms and you immediately picture, I don't know, some dusty religious artifact or like quiet, polite poetry read in a serene building with stained glass, you are missing the point entirely.
You're completely missing it.
This collection of writings, it's a raw, unflinching, blood and dirt human survival guide.
I love that. The word raw is just the perfect descriptor here because we usually approach diagnostic tools with an expectation of like clinical precision, right?
Yeah, totally.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor just points to it. It's binary. It's either broken or not broken.
Super clear cut.
Exactly. But when you step into the world of human emotion or neurodevelopment, of trauma, of these existential crises, that binary x-ray machine just shatters. The diagnostic landscape of the human soul is incredibly murky.
It's so messy, and yet somehow these ancient authors mapped it. So in this deep dive, we are going to trace the absolute extremes of the human experience. We're going to start down in those murky depths, feeling completely lost, wrestling with the kind of profound anger we usually try to hide from our therapists.
And stuff we don't want to admit out loud.
Right, hitting absolute rock bottom. And then we're going to trace the psychological and spiritual mechanics of how a human being actually climbs out of that abyss, how they locate a moral compass in the dark, and eventually reach this, cosmic crescendo of gratitude and awe.
Because the texts really act as a mirror. I mean, they reflect the human condition back to us with this startling, almost uncomfortable clarity.
Yeah, uncomfortable is a good word for it.
It really is. And this specific collection offers a masterclass in how to process pain, how to find boundaries that actually create freedom, which we'll get into, and ultimately how to live a life of meaning. So, the setting is ancient, but the psychology underpinning these chapters is shockingly modern.
Well, let's jump right into the deep end then, because human beings usually don't start seeking profound wisdom when everything is going perfectly right.
Oh, definitely not. We wait until the wheels fall off.
Exactly. We usually start paying attention when we're in the middle of a massive crisis, and that is exactly where Psalm 107 drops us.
Yeah, and to really grasp the gravity of Psalm 107, we have to establish the historical and human context the author is operating within. So historical commentators like Albert Barnes, they note that this text was likely composed right after the return of the Israelites from the Babylonian exile.
Which connects to that intro scenario.
Right. We just talked about the trauma of them being dragged away.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward 70 years.
70 years. I mean, that is 3 generations of people.
Entire lifetimes spent in captivity. I mean, they lived as an assimilated captive population in this massive foreign empire. They lost their sacred temple, their centralized government, their autonomy, everything.
So completely stripped away.
Exactly. And then suddenly the geopolitical landscape shifts. The Persian Empire takes over, and overnight they are allowed to go back. So imagine this massive, traumatized population of refugees. The text explicitly states that they are gathering together from the lands from the east, the west, the north, and the south.
So you have this monumental convergence of people, and they're bringing all their varied multi-generational traumas with them. Like, they're coming from every direction, which means they've survived entirely different sets of horrors to get there.
Yeah, a huge mix of experiences.
And the author of Psalm 107 does something just brilliant here. Instead of writing a generic summary of their pain, he paints 4 distinct, incredibly visceral vignettes of human suffering. It's as if the author is walking through like a triage tent, pointing at different beds and saying, look at all the distinct ways a human life can completely fall apart.
I love that triage tent analogy because each vignette captures a completely different flavor of human desperation. It maps the topography of crisis.
Right. So the first picture he paints is the crisis of the wanderers. The text says they wandered in the wilderness in a desolate way, finding no city to dwell in. They're hungry and thirsty, and their soul is literally fainting within them. And when you read the ancient context of wilderness, this isn't like a pleasant hike through a pine forest where you got turned around.
Oh, no, not at all. The ancient Near Eastern wilderness is a brutal, completely uninhabited region. We're talking scorching sand, jagged rocks, and absolutely zero resources. It is a hostile environment designed to kill you.
It's terrifying.
It is. The physical reality of wandering in that space meant hyperthermia, dehydration, and basically a slow, agonizing demise. But metaphorically, this maps perfectly onto a very specific type of modern psychological crisis, the crisis of being utterly deprived and directionless.
It's the sheer exhaustion of effort without reward. Think about the seasons in your life where you are trying your absolute hardest. You know, you're putting one foot in front of the other, you're expending massive amounts of energy, maybe in a career that's going nowhere, or trying to save a relationship that's constantly draining you, and nothing is yielding fruit.
You're just spinning your wheels.
Exactly. You are walking endlessly, but finding no city to dwell in, no place of rest. You're just drained. The soul fainting within you is basically a perfect ancient description of modern burnout.
And importantly, the text doesn't assign blame to the wanderers. They're just victims of circumstance. They're just lost. But then we move to the second picture, and the tone shifts dramatically here. This is the vignette of the prisoners. The author describes people sitting in darkness and the shadow of death, bound in affliction and iron.
But the crucial detail here is the why, right? Because the text explicitly states that they are in chains because they rebelled against the words of God and despised the counsel of the Most High. This is a massive shift from the wanderers. Like, this isn't accidental suffering, and it isn't collateral damage from a geopolitical war. This is entirely self-inflicted.
Yeah, this is the crisis of consequence. The commentator Matthew Henry uses this really brilliant phrase to describe the dynamic. He observes that the text says, he brought down their heart with labor. And Henry suggests these were people walking with a haughty air.
Oh, it was like a real arrogance to them.
Precisely. They were completely self-sufficient, fiercely independent, convinced of their own brilliance. They were offered good advice, wise counsel, ancient boundaries, and they looked at it all and basically said, I know better.
Which is such a deeply human instinct, isn't it? The arrogance to look at the collected wisdom of the past and assume we're somehow the exception to the rule. We ignore the warning signs about our finances. We ignore the red flags in our behavior. We push away the people trying to hold us accountable.
We think you're untouchable.
Right. And as a result, we stumble and end up locked in a prison of our own making, metaphorical chains or sometimes literal ones. We build our own cages out of our pride.
It's so true. So the author is layering these experiences. First, the circumstantial pain of the wanderer, then the self-inflicted pain of the proud prisoner. And that flows directly into the third vignette, which is even more destructive. The sick, or as the text pretty bluntly translates it, the fools.
Yeah, the text says they are afflicted because of their rebellious ways and their iniquities. And the imagery here is just terrifying. It says, their soul abhors all manner of food, and they draw near to the gates of death.
This is the ancient world's description of severe pathology and addiction. Albert Barnes' commentary notes that the phrasing implies they afflict themselves by their own course of transgression. The suffering here isn't a lightning bolt thrown from the sky by an angry deity.
Right, it's not a punishment from above.
No, it's the natural, physiological, and psychological result of their own actions.
The phrase, their soul abhors all manner of food, is so haunting to me. Because when a human body is profoundly sick or poisoned, its natural instinct is to reject nourishment. Like the very thing that could save it, food. Water makes it nauseous.
And exactly the same mechanism applies to the human psyche. The soul When someone is caught in the deep throes of addiction or really toxic behavioral patterns, they lose their appetite for anything healthy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. The people who genuinely love them become repulsive to them. Honest conversation feels suffocating. Peace and stability feel boring. They have consumed so much toxicity that their palate is entirely corrupted. They are basically starving themselves to death at the gates of death while aggressively rejecting the medicine.
It's the ultimate self-sabotage. So we have the wanderers, the prisoners, the addicts, and then the author gives us the fourth picture, which is arguably the most cinematic and terrifying of them all, the sailors.
This one is intense.
It really is. The text describes people who go down to the sea in ships, professionals who do business on the great waters. But a massive storm hits, the waves mount up to the heavens and then crash down to the depths. The author says their soul melts away because of the trouble. They reel back and forth, they stagger like a drunkard, and this is the phrase that has echoed through centuries of literature. They are at their wits' end.
And that phrase in the original Hebrew is incredibly evocative. It literally translates to, all their wisdom is swallowed up.
Swallowed up, that's so visual.
Yeah, and you have to understand how terrifying the open ocean was to the ancient mind. The sea was the ultimate symbol of primordial chaos. It was completely untamable. And these sailors aren't amateurs, right? They're merchants. They know the currents. They have the best nautical architecture of their day. They have the stars mapped out.
They know what they're doing.
Exactly. When a storm of this magnitude hits, all of that accumulated human wisdom is instantly swallowed by the chaos.
Wisdom swallowed up. That concept translates so perfectly into a modern reality. Like, think about the systems we built today to keep the chaos at bay. We are completely obsessed with control.
Oh, 100%.
Imagine you're driving through a sprawling, unfamiliar metropolis. You have your smartphone mounted on the dashboard. The GPS is giving you turn-by-turn directions, actively rerouting you around traffic. You have a full tank of gas. The climate control is set to a perfect 70 degrees. Your favorite music is streaming seamlessly.
You're in your own little bubble.
Right, you feel like a master of your universe. You are insulated, and then suddenly the screen glitches and goes black. The cellular network drops entirely, the car engine sputters, and just dies on a busy 8-lane highway.
The insulation shatters, just like that.
In a fraction of a second, all your 21st century technology, all your meticulous planning, all your life hacks and optimization routines just evaporate. You are suddenly just a fragile biological organism sitting in a metal box surrounded by fast-moving hazards.
You realize the profound illusion of your own mastery.
Yes. You realize you are bobbing in a modern storm, entirely out of control. And, that storm doesn't have to be meteorological. It could be a corporate storm where the entire industry you built your career in collapses overnight due to a market shift.
Right, or a relational storm.
Exactly, where a marriage you thought was invincible suddenly falls apart. Or a medical storm where a routine checkup ends with a terrifying diagnosis. In those moments, all your tools, your money, your influence, your wisdom is swallowed up. You reel back and forth. You are at your wits' end.
So the architecture of Psalm 107 is building toward this massive philosophical reveal. We have these four wildly different groups. The wanderers, who are just victims of a harsh environment. The sailors, who are caught in a chaotic force of nature. But then we have the prisoners and the fools, who absolutely undeniably brought their suffering upon themselves through pride, rebellion, and self-destructive habits.
Right.
Yet, there is a repeating refrain that acts as the rhythmic heartbeat of this entire chapter. After each of these four vignettes of disaster, the text repeats the exact same sentence. Then they tried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distresses.
Wait, look at the mechanics of what the author is saying there. Look at who is being rescued.
Exactly. That is the paradigm-shifting insight of this text. The deliverance comes completely, regardless of the origin of the trouble. The rescue mechanism does not differentiate between circumstantial tragedy and self-inflicted disaster.
That's incredible.
It is. The sailors didn't cause the storm. But the addicts and the arrogant prisoners, they were entirely at fault. And yet, the text makes absolutely no distinction in how the rescue is applied.
The rescue does not require a pristine moral resume. It doesn't require you to prove that you didn't deserve the storm.
Right. And if we cross-reference this with Psalm 130, which is also part of this specific collection, the theology becomes even clearer. The author of Psalm 130 writes from a place of deep despair, saying, "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord." And then he makes this profound observation about the nature of divine justice. He says, "If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness."
Who could stand? No one.
Exactly. The fundamental mechanism of grace outlined in these texts is not based on human perfection or merit. It is based entirely on the human willingness to recognize our own total bankruptcy and just ask for intervention.
Which completely and utterly challenges how you and I are conditioned to operate in the modern world. I mean, we live in a hyper-competitive culture of fake it till you make it.
Oh yeah, never show weakness.
We are taught from a very young age to curate our image, to project constant competence, to optimize our productivity, and to hide our vulnerability at all costs. Like, the cardinal rule of modern professional and social life is never let them see you sweat. If your ship is sinking, you are supposed to stand on the deck and confidently pitch the investors on how you are turning the boat into a submarine.
It's absurd, but it's true. We view admitting defeat as the ultimate failure.
But this ancient text argues the exact opposite. It argues that holding on to the illusion of control is the thing that will actually kill you. Yeah. Hitting rock bottom, admitting you are entirely out of your depth, and crying out in raw desperation is not a failure of character. It is the prerequisite for rescue. It's the beginning of actual wisdom.
Because you cannot be saved from drowning if you are using all your remaining energy to convince the lifeguard that you are just enjoying a vigorous swim. The pivot toward survival requires the absolute death of pride.
That's a great way to put it. So if we are translating this ancient wisdom into a modern practice for you, the listener, it comes down to a very specific pivot. When you hit your wit's end this week, and, if you are engaging with the real world, you will hit it in some capacity, big or small. Observe your default reaction.
Pay attention to what you do naturally.
Right. Our natural instinct is to grip the steering wheel tighter. We try to outthink the storm. We try to force a solution through sheer willpower. The practice here is to do the opposite. The moment you recognize the storm, simply acknowledge your complete lack of control. Drop the heavy, exhausting facade of competence.
So let it go.
Say it out loud in your car or in your kitchen if you have to. I am out of my depth. All my wisdom is swallowed up. I need help. That terrifying vulnerability is not the end of your story. According to this text, it is the door to your deliverance.
That dynamic of rescue is so profound, but it naturally leads us to the next logical question in human development. If Psalm 107 is the manual for surviving the storm once you're already drowning, how do we avoid crashing the ship onto the rocks in the first place?
Yes, we don't want to just drown repeatedly.
Right. We can't just live in a perpetual cycle of disaster and rescue. We need a navigational chart. We need a system to understand the topography of the world so we can move through it without constantly destroying ourselves. And that brings us to Psalm 119.
Right, we need a map. But I have to be honest, looking at Psalm 119 as a modern reader, it is an incredibly intimidating, almost repetitive piece of text. Like, it's a massive wall of words.
It is the longest chapter in the entire biblical canon, actually. Yep. And its literary structure is fascinating and deeply intentional. It's an acrostic poem.
Yeah.
In the original Hebrew, it is divided into 22 stanzas, corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Oh.
Yeah. The first 8 verses all begin with the first letter, Aleph. The next 8 verses begin with the second letter, Beth, and it continues this exact pattern all the way to the final letter, Tav.
To a modern reader, that feels incredibly rigid. It feels like an artificial constraint on poetry. Why construct a text with such aggressive parameters?
Well, on a practical level, we have to remember, this emerged from an oral culture. A complex acrostic structure is a highly effective mnemonic device. It helps the community memorize massive blocks of text.
That makes sense.
But on a deeper theological and philosophical level, the A to Z structure symbolizes absolute completeness. By utilizing every single letter of the alphabet, the author is making a really bold claim. This is the exhaustive, complete, total guide to the human experience.
Okay, but reading it straight through is difficult because it doesn't build a single narrative arc. There's no rising action and climax.
Which is why the commentator Matthew Henry offers such a helpful framework for understanding it. He says we shouldn't view Psalm 119 as a chain of gold links, because in a chain, every link depends entirely on the one before it to make a sequential, logical argument. If you break one link, the whole argument falls apart.
Right.
Instead, Henry describes this text as a chest of gold rings.
A chest of gold rings that completely changes how you interact with it.
It means it's a collection of profound, standalone truths. You can reach into the chest, pull out any single ring, any individual verse, and examine it for its own intrinsic beauty and value. And the singular, unyielding obsession of every single ring in this chest is the concept of the law, the word, the statutes, the precepts of God.
And here is where I really need to push back on behalf of the modern listener, because I hear the words law, statutes, commandments, and precepts, and my 21st century brain instantly recoils.
Of course it does.
Right. Those words connote speed limits, bureaucratic red tape, arbitrary restriction, and just a suffocating lack of personal autonomy. We are culturally conditioned to view rules as the fundamental enemy of authentic self-expression.
That is absolutely the dominant cultural narrative right now. Yes.
But the author of Psalm 119 makes a claim that sounds like pure madness to us today. In verse 45, he writes, "I will walk in liberty, for I have sought your precepts." He is explicitly equating submission to rules with the experience of freedom. How on earth do ancient rules equal freedom? That feels like a massive, unresolvable contradiction.
It is a paradox, for sure, but it is one of the most vital paradoxes of the human condition. We are currently living in a world that is virtually paralyzed by infinite choices and moral relativism.
Decision fatigue is real.
Very real. We're sold the idea that true freedom is the absolute absence of all external constraints, the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want, defined entirely by our internal desires. But psychology and sociology are increasingly showing us that infinite choice does not produce human flourishing. It produces profound anxiety, decision fatigue, and ultimately a sense of meaninglessness. The author of Psalm 119 understood something fundamental about the architecture of reality. Boundaries are what actually create freedom.
Okay, let's ground that. Give me a concrete way to visualize how a boundary creates freedom. Because it sounds nice, but what does it mean?
Think of the engineering of a high-speed train. A train is an immensely powerful machine. It's capable of incredible speed, efficiency, and transporting massive amounts of weight over vast distances. But that power is contingent on one absolute limitation. It must stay on its tracks.
Right, without the tracks, it's going nowhere.
Exactly. The tracks are rigid, unyielding, and narrow. Now, suppose someone comes along and says, "It is a tragedy that this magnificent machine is restricted to these steel lines. I want to liberate it. I want it to be free to explore the meadows and the forests."
If you take the train off the tracks to free it, it doesn't become majestic. It becomes a catastrophe.
Exactly. It sinks into the mud, it crashes, it destroys itself and its surrounding environment. The constraint of the track was not the enemy of the train's freedom. The constraint was the very mechanism that allowed the train to fulfill its purpose.
That is a brilliant image. It reminds me of a river, too. Without the strict, unyielding boundaries of the riverbanks, you don't have a powerful, life-giving river. The water just spreads out in every direction, loses its momentum, and becomes a shallow, stagnant, destructive swamp.
That's a perfect analogy.
The rigid constraint of the banks is what creates the power and the direction of the water.
And humans are designed with similar structural realities. We are not infinitely malleable. We are designed to thrive when we are aligned with the fundamental grain of the universe. The law or statutes presented in Psalm 119 are not arbitrary, petty rules designed by a tyrant to make human life miserable. They are the manufacturer's operating instructions.
Wow.
They are the tracks. They are the riverbanks. When we align our moral and ethical lives with those ancient precepts, we don't experience a loss of identity. We experience the profound liberty of functioning exactly as we were designed to function.
That really reframes the entire concept of obedience. It isn't about blind submission. It's about alignment with reality. And that perfectly eliminates verse 105, which is arguably the most famous gold ring in this entire chest. The verse says, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path."
Such a classic verse.
It is. But again, we have a translation issue with the modern mind. If a model listener hears "light for my path," they are picturing a 10,000 lumen LED floodlight mounted on a truck that illuminates the forest for 3 miles in every direction.
Which is precisely what our anxiety demands. We want the entire 10-year plan illuminated. We want every potential risk analyzed and mitigated before we take a single step.
Exactly. But a lamp in the ancient Middle East was a completely different technology. It was this tiny, shallow clay dish. You filled it with a little bit of olive oil, floated a flax wick in it, and lit it. It flickered. It sputtered. If you were walking on a treacherous, unpaved, ancient road at night, where there are literal ravines and bandits, that little clay lamp did not illuminate the horizon.
It didn't show you the destination.
Not at all. It barely pushed back the darkness. It put out just enough light to show you the ground immediately in front of your feet. It only illuminated the very next step.
The psychological implications of that are staggering, really. It means that engaging with this wisdom requires a tremendous ongoing capacity for trust. You are not granted the illusion of certainty. The text argues that you will only receive enough moral clarity and light to make the single next correct choice. You do not get to see the final destination or the 5 steps after this one before you commit your weight to the path.
It forces you to be entirely present. You can't live in the anxiety of the future because you can't see the future. You can only see the next right thing. But there is another ring in this chest that is much harder to hold. It's a concept that aggressively offends our modern sensibilities.
Which one?
In verse 71, the author writes, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I may learn your statutes." How do we make sense of someone claiming that profound affliction is actually a net positive?
Yeah, this requires careful discernment. It directly challenges our base instinct to label all pain as inherently evil and all comfort as inherently good. We spend billions of dollars and massive amounts of energy trying to insulate ourselves from any form of affliction.
Comfort is the ultimate goal in our society.
It is. But anyone who is a careful observer of the human condition, and this is heavily corroborated by modern psychological studies on post-traumatic growth, knows that uninterrupted comfort rarely, if ever, produces deep character. It is often only in the crucible of retrospective analysis that we recognize a terrifying truth. Our deepest moral growth, our deepest understanding of those life-giving boundaries we just discussed, came directly out of our most agonizing trials.
The author actually admits this a few verses earlier, doesn't he? He says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word." The pain was the rumble strip on the highway. It was the guardrail that bruised him, but ultimately bounced him back onto the tracks before he went over the cliff entirely.
We don't seek out pain. Nobody wants it. But the text suggests that when pain inevitably arises, it can be metabolized into wisdom.
So, how does the listener apply Psalm 119 today? Well, the text suggests that you need to stop demanding the 10-year plan. The crushing weight you are feeling right now is likely the anxiety of trying to control a distant future that you cannot possibly illuminate. The practice is to lower your gaze from the horizon to the ground right in front of you.
Just focus on what's right there.
Right. Ask yourself, what does the lamp of ancient wisdom, of clear moral boundaries, show as the single next right step for you today? Not the step you need to take next month, just a step for this afternoon. Make that decision. Take that step. And trust that the light will move forward with you.
That is a powerful practice for navigating uncertainty. But we also have to be intellectually honest about the nature of the path. Sometimes the darkness isn't just a lack of direction. Sometimes the darkness is populated.
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
Sometimes the path is actively, violently hostile. The pain isn't just a circumstantial storm or a self-inflicted wound. What happens when other human beings are the deliberate architects of our affliction?
Which brings us to the most difficult terrain in our journey, the dark valleys. We are looking at Psalms 109, 137, and 140. And look, I am not going to sugarcoat this, and I am not going to warn you to brace yourselves. I am just going to let the text speak, because these are some of the most jarring words in ancient literature.
They really are. These are known as the imprecatory psalms. They are, quite literally, prayers for vengeance, and they refuse to participate in toxic positivity. They do not slap a polite spiritual smiley face over a gaping emotional gunshot wound.
No, they don't. Listen to the raw, unfiltered violence of Psalm 137. The author writes about his captors, the Babylonians, and says, "Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks."
It's hard to even hear that.
It is. And in Psalm 109, the author's praying against an enemy and says, "May his children be wandering beggars. May they be driven from their ruined homes. May a creditor seize all he has. May his descendants be cut off." It is a methodical, generational curse.
It is absolutely brutal. And it is vital that we apply a rigorous rule of discernment here. We are analyzing these texts as historical and psychological artifacts. Examining them does not mean we are endorsing the violence they describe, nor are we holding them up as a behavioral model for how to treat our enemies.
Then why are they included in a book that claims to be a repository of wisdom? If the goal is moral alignment, why preserve the furious, hateful rantings of someone who literally wants to murder babies?
To understand the profound psychological utility of these texts, you have to remember the context we established at the very beginning. Remember the Babylonian exile? The author of Psalm 137 is not a grumpy neighbor dealing with a property line dispute.
Right, this isn't everyday annoyance.
No, this text was written by the traumatized survivors of one of the most savage military campaigns in human history. The Babylonians besieged Jerusalem. They starved the civilian population to the point of absolute desperation. When they breached the walls, they slaughtered indiscriminately. And the historical reality of ancient siege warfare is that conquering armies routinely executed the infants of the vanquished to prevent future uprisings.
Oh, wow. So they lived through that.
They witnessed it.
Yeah.
So the horrific imagery of dashing babies against rocks in Psalm 137 is not an abstract metaphor. It is a traumatic mirror. The author is wishing back upon the Babylonians the exact literal atrocity that the Babylonians just committed against the Israelites.
They are sitting by the rivers of Babylon, weeping, surrounded by the people who murdered their families, and those murderers are mocking them, demanding a song.
The psychological cruelty and the sheer volume of trauma are almost incalculable. So why is the preservation of this unvarnished rage valuable for a modern listener? Because modern clinical psychology confirms exactly what these ancient authors intuitively knew. Suppressing intense, legitimate anger in the wake of profound betrayal or abuse is catastrophic for the human psyche.
It destroys you.
It does. If you pretend you are not furious when your soul has been violated, that unexpressed rage will metastasize. It turns into depression, it destroys your physical health, and it inevitably leaks out as collateral damage onto innocent people around you. The Psalms are modeling a vital psychological mechanism here, radical, uncensored emotional honesty.
It makes me think of a common therapeutic exercise. Imagine someone has deeply, intentionally ruined a part of your life. Like they stole your life savings, they abused your trust, they destroyed your reputation. A therapist will often tell you to sit down and write that person a letter.
Ah, yes, the unsent letter.
Exactly. And the rule of the exercise is that you do not filter yourself. You don't try to be the bigger person. You write down every dark, hateful, vindictive, vicious thought that is echoing in your amygdala. You articulate the absolute darkest, most violent desires of your soul.
You give the monster a voice so you can actually look at it. But, and this is the hinge upon which this entire mechanism turns, the therapist will tell you that under no circumstances do you actually mail that letter.
Right. You never send it. You articulate the vengeance, but you do not execute the vengeance. In the psychological framework of the Psalms, you write that brutal, unforgiving letter, you pour every ounce of poison out of your system onto the page, and then you hand the letter over to a higher, ultimate judge. You say, this is the depth of my hatred. I want them destroyed. I want their children to suffer. You articulate the demand for absolute justice, but you relinquish the sword. You refuse to take the execution of that justice into your own hands.
The Apostle Paul later echoes this exact sentiment when he writes, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." By venting this radioactive rage, vertically directing it up toward the divine, the psalmist is actively preventing himself from acting it out horizontally against his neighbor.
That's a safety valve.
It is a profound, necessary psychological safety valve. Diffusing the amygdala requires acknowledging the reality of the threat and the anger, but moving forward requires trusting that the moral arc of the universe will eventually handle the scales of justice. When you read Psalm 109, you are not reading an instruction manual for revenge, you are reading the transcript of a victim handing their deepest trauma over to the only judge capable of sorting it out with perfect equity.
Which completely challenges our modern relationship with our own negative emotions. We have been conditioned to sanitize our internal monologues. We think we are only allowed to express acceptable or productive levels of frustration, but the text suggests that this sanitation is a lie that keeps us sick.
It's toxic.
It is. So the practical application here is terrifying but necessary. Stop filtering your pain when you are processing it internally. If you've been deeply wronged, be radically honest about the darkness of your anger. Write it down. Speak it into the empty room. Acknowledge the violence of your own hurt. And then once you have brought the monster out into the light, release it.
Just hand it over.
Hand the unsent letter over to the universe, to God, to the ultimate mechanism of justice. Let go of the exhausting, corrosive need to personally exact revenge. Stepping away from the role of executioner is the only way to heal.
But, that level of radical vulnerability introduces a massive new problem.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, if you actually admit the darkest, most hateful thoughts of your soul, even just to yourself or to the divine, the immediate byproduct is usually intense shame. We think, if anyone actually knew what I was capable of thinking, if they knew the violence in my heart, I would be utterly condemned. I would be cast out. How is it possible to be that brutally honest without being crushed by the fear of rejection?
Ah, I see. You can only be that honest if you are absolutely convinced that the person you are talking to already knows everything about you and has not abandoned you. Which brings us to the antidote to isolation. We're looking at Psalm 139 and the Songs of Ascents.
Right. And Psalm 139 is widely considered by literary scholars to be one of the most staggering, magnificent pieces of poetry ever composed. The core wisdom here wrestles with the concept of omniscience, the idea of being completely, infinitely known. The author writes, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar."
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because if you read those words through a modern, cynical lens, it doesn't sound comforting. It sounds like a dystopian nightmare.
It sounds a bit creepy.
It sounds like the ultimate surveillance state. Big Brother reading your thoughts. A cold, unblinking CCTV camera tracking your every movement, logging your data, waiting for you to make a mistake.
That is our modern trauma speaking, for sure. We live in a surveillance capitalist society, so we naturally equate being watched with being judged, categorized, or controlled for someone else's profit. But the semantic domain and the tone of Psalm 139 are entirely different. This is not the gaze of a warden. This is the gaze of an architect.
It's the difference between a security guard watching you on a grainy monitor to see if you shoplift and a master artist staring intimately at the magnum opus they just painted, knowing every single brushstroke, every layer of pigment, every intentional detail.
Beautifully put.
The text goes on to say, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." This is the intimate knowledge of a creator who understands you implicitly because he engineered your very existence.
And the commentator Barnes notes a beautiful mathematical detail later in the psalm. The author says, "How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand."
Outnumber the grains of sand.
The divine isn't just passively logging your coordinates. His mind is actively, continuously, overwhelmingly occupied with you in a posture of precious care. And the author realizes that this presence is inescapable. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, even the darkness will not be dark to you.
Think about the psychological liberation of that realization. If you are known at that granular, subatomic level, if the divine knows the ugliest, most vindictive thoughts you wrote in that unsent letter, and yet his thoughts toward you are still precious and outnumber the sand, then the architecture of shame completely collapses.
You have nothing to hide.
You don't have to posture. You don't have to curate your image. You are safe to be entirely authentic because you cannot possibly shock the God who knit you together.
Deep vertical intimacy with the divine neutralizes the shame that causes us to isolate ourselves. And what is endlessly fascinating about the Psalms is how this vertical intimacy is meant to immediately scale horizontally into our human relationships.
That transition is perfectly captured in the Songs of Ascents, which are Psalms 120 through 134. These were, quite literally, the ancient world's road trip playlist.
Exactly. 3 times a year, the Israelites would travel from their scattered agricultural villages all over the region to go up to Jerusalem for the major religious festivals. The geography required them to literally ascend into the mountains to reach the city. They didn't travel alone, they traveled in massive caravans. Families, extended relatives, neighbors, all walking the dusty roads together for days. And as they walked, they sang these specific 15 psalms. They are the soundtrack of shared human journey and community.
Let's look at how this community is structured then. Psalm 127 talks about the fundamental building block of community, the family. It says children are a heritage from the Lord, and it compares them to arrows in the hands of a warrior. And, I think about the implications of this metaphor all the time. Think about the engineering of an arrow. You spend immense time crafting it, making sure the shaft is straight, balancing the fletching, sharpening the tip, but you don't do all that work just to keep the arrow safely tucked inside the quiver forever.
No, if the arrow stays in the quiver, it has failed its purpose. Its entire teleological design is meant for the tension of the bowstring and the friction of the air.
Yes. But as parents, as mentors, as managers or leaders of the next generation, our cultural instinct is often extreme protectionism. We want to wrap the next generation in bubble wrap and keep them safely inside the house where they can't be harmed by the world.
Wouldn't keep them in the quiver.
But the text argues for a dynamic, outward-facing view of development. Our job is to shape them, balance them, give them a strong moral tip, pull back the bowstring, and violently launch them into the future to make an impact in times and places we will never live to see.
It is community designed for outward momentum. But, that momentum requires internal cohesion. And that brings us to Psalm 133, which focuses on unity within the broader community. The author writes, "How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity." But then he uses a metaphor that sounds frankly bizarre, maybe even repulsive to a modern listener.
The oil metaphor, right.
Right. He compares this beautiful unity to precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe.
I mean, having a quart of oil dumped on your head and soaking into your clothes does not immediately evoke the word pleasant. It evokes a massive dry cleaning bill and a desperate need for a shower.
True. But we have to translate the cultural value here. In the ancient Near East, anointing oil was not motor oil. It was an incredibly expensive, highly concentrated perfume infused with myrrh, cinnamon, and fragrant cane. It represented joy, wealth, and the presence of the divine. And when Aaron, the high priest, was consecrated, they didn't just elegantly dab a little drop behind his ears. They poured the horn over his head. It was extravagant, copious, and undeniably messy. It saturated everything.
So the metaphor is saying that true community, true unity is like that oil. It is incredibly valuable and it consecrates the group, making it a holy space. But it is also messy. It gets on everything.
Precisely. You cannot have the profound beauty of human unity without the inevitable friction and messiness of actual human proximity. We want the theoretical idea of community, but we run away the moment someone offends us or we have to deal with their baggage. The text argues that the mess is the anointing. When you commit to the friction of living closely with other flawed humans, the fragrance of that shared commitment changes the atmosphere of the entire group.
So we arrive at the practical challenge of this section. The reality of isolation versus intimacy. Psalm 139 ends with a daring, almost terrifying invitation to the divine. "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me." We just discussed how difficult it is to let ourselves be truly known.
It's the hardest thing.
The practice for you is to take that vertical invitation and apply it horizontally. Are you willing to invite someone into the messiness of your life? Are you willing to ask a trusted friend, a partner, or a mentor to lovingly but honestly search your life and point out your blind spots? Not to condemn you, but to help keep you aligned with those life-giving tracks we talked about earlier. Who currently holds the mirror up for you? If the answer is no one, you are entirely isolated no matter how many people you are surrounded by.
That is a profound challenge, and it brings us to a critical inflection point. If a human being actually walks this path, if you have survived the devastating storm by crying out in vulnerability, if you have found your footing by trusting the lamp for the next step, if you have processed your deepest, most violent traumas without acting on them, and if you have realized that you are intimately known and safely embedded in a messy but beautiful community, what happens next?
What's left?
Right. What is the final psychological and spiritual destination of this entire journey?
That brings us to our final destination, the crescendo. We are looking at the final chapters of the book, Songs 145 through 150, and the shift in the text here is absolute.
It is night and day. If you read these final psalms in sequence, the change in tone is unmistakable. We have left the dark valleys. We have left the tears of exile. This is an absolute, unmitigated explosion of praise. These chapters are historically known as the Hallelujah Psalms because almost every single verse is an imperative command to praise.
It reads like a cosmic symphony. The sheer volume, the relentless repetition of the command to praise the Lord is almost overwhelming to the reader. It is as if the author has exhausted the capacity of human language, so he just starts repeating the command, desperately calling on everything in the known universe, the angels, the sun, the moon, the sea monsters, the mountains, the kings, the children, to join in the chorus.
And there is a deep psychological and neurobiological truth embedded in this crescendo. Across almost all major human wisdom traditions and modern psychological frameworks, gratitude and awe are recognized as the ultimate antidotes to anxiety, cynicism, and despair. You literally cannot hold toxic, self-pitying resentment in your frontal lobe at the exact same moment you're experiencing a state of profound awe. They are mutually exclusive psychological states.
But the gratitude commanded in the Psalms is not the modern secular version of gratitude. It isn't just a vague sending positive vibes into the universe or keeping a private journal of things you like. It is highly specific, and it is directed outward at a specific creator.
Right. And that creator is described as holding two seemingly contradictory, impossible realities in perfect tension. Look at the breathtaking paradox the author constructs in Psalm 147. He writes, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." And then, in the very next breath, without breaking the poetic meter, he writes, "He determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name."
The juxtaposition there is stunning. The author is marrying infinite, incomprehensible cosmic power, the ability to map and name billions of burning galaxies across the expanding universe with the most delicate, intimate, granular tenderness imaginable. The exact same God who manages the staggering astrophysics of the cosmos is the God who sits down in the dirt to gently bandage a bleeding, traumatized human heart.
It is the ultimate synthesis of majesty and mercy. It is power utilized entirely for the sake of love. And when a human being truly deeply grasps that reality, when they see the X-ray of the universe and realize it is held together by that kind of benevolent power, the only logical physiological response is what we see in the grand finale, Psalm 150.
Psalm 150 is the fireworks display at the end of the journey. And I love the specific details the author includes. He doesn't just say praise quietly in your heart. He calls for the trumpets, the lutes, the harps, the tambourines, the flutes, and the resounding clashing cymbals. He explicitly calls for dancing. It is loud, it is chaotic, it is intensely physical, it demands the engagement of the entire body.
Which violently challenges our often sterilized, highly intellectualized modern view of spirituality. We often think of reverence as requiring absolute stillness. We sit silently in rows, or we meditate without moving a muscle. And as we saw in the quiet intimacy of Psalm 139, there's absolutely a time and place for stillness. But the crescendo of the Psalms insists that ultimate gratitude must also be externalized.
You have to express it.
It must be vocalized. It must be felt in the muscles and the bones. The commentator Matthew Henry beautifully notes that hallelujah is the echo of heaven. When we practice it here with all our physical energy, we are not just making noise, we are rehearsing for eternity. We are actively tuning our instruments to join a song that is already echoing through the architecture of reality.
So how do we apply this massive cosmic symphony to a regular Tuesday morning? Most of us are not walking into our offices with resounding cymbals and tambourines, but the metaphor holds. The practice for you today is to identify what is your instrument. The psalmist lists literal instruments of the ancient world, but metaphorically, your instrument is whatever you've been given to interact with reality.
It's whatever you bring to the table.
Exactly. It is your specific tone of voice. It is your unique intellectual talents. It is the way you execute your daily work. It is the patience you use when raising your kids. It is the integrity with which you treat your employees. The question is, how can you consciously pick up your instrument today and play it in a way that contributes to the grand symphony of gratitude, rather than just adding to the exhausting ambient noise of societal complaining, cynicism, and outrage? How do you play your specific note of awe?
It requires a daily, deliberate choice. You have to look at the undeniable reality of the world with all its brutal storms, its self-inflicted prisons, and its dark, hostile valleys, and still stubbornly choose to play the note of awe.
Which brings us to one final provocative thought to leave you with. I want you to look at the very last line of the entire book of Psalms, Psalm 150, verse 6. After 150 chapters of complex theology, historical trauma, moral failure, and divine rescue, the text ends with one simple, all-encompassing command. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Think about the profound inclusivity of that requirement. The fundamental qualification for joining this cosmic symphony is not moral perfection.
No, it's not.
It is not having a pristine track record of making the right choices. It is not having a massive bank account or a trouble-free life or having all of your philosophical and theological questions neatly answered. The only requirement to participate in the purpose of the universe is simply having breath.
If your lungs are expanding and contracting, if you listen to this, you are entirely qualified. You are invited.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what if you let that reality reframe your entire mindset today? What if you decided to view the autonomic nervous system as a spiritual mechanism? Every single breath you take, involuntarily, thousands of times a day, even while you sleep. What if you viewed every expansion of your lungs as a subconscious biological act of gratitude? You don't have to force it. Your very existence, the fact that you are still breathing after whatever storms you have survived, is a living testament to the miracle of grace. We started this deep dive talking about the desire for clean, binary X-rays. We said that the human soul is murky water, and we have certainly waded through that.
We really have.
We have seen the depths of self-destruction, the terror of the storm, the raw, unfiltered violence of betrayal and grief. But maybe the Psalms are an X-ray after all. Not a simple image of a broken bone, but a high-definition scan of the human condition itself. And when you hold this magnificent ancient X-ray up to the light, past all the fractures, past the shadows, and past the trauma, what you see at the very core, in the very marrow of our existence, is a profound, inextinguishable need to be known, a desperate need to be forgiven, and the ultimate capacity to stand in absolute awe of the light.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present. where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.